Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today we're going to be sharing some creepy and downright strange search and rescue and Firewatch horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp, and stories like yours will help keep this show going on a daily basis. Now, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and get ready for these creepy and downright strange search and rescue and Firewatch horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. Rescue on El Capitan. Neal Olsen. On September 23rd, 1972, a breathtaking autumn sun began to rise over the majestic El Capitan, casting long shadows within Yosemite Valley. The iconic granite monolith attracted climbers from all over the world. But on this particular day, all eyes were on Neal Olsen and his climbing team. Neal was an experienced climber with a reputation for his technical skills. He was leading his group through one of the most challenging sections of the 24th pitch of the legendary Nose Route. The Nose was a celebrated climb renowned for its demanding features, steep walls, and sudden weather changes. Much had been written about its beauty and danger, and Neal knew this well. He had spent countless hours training and preparing for this moment. As he secured his gear and communicated with his team, a sense of camaraderie enveloped them. They were not just climbers. They were a family united by their passion for their mountains. As they ascended, the atmosphere changed rapidly. The serenity of the morning was abruptly interrupted by dark and heavy, ominous clouds rolling in from the west. Neal and his team, in high spirits, continued their climb despite the unsettling weather. Sometime around noon, the first raindrops began to fall, but they pressed on, determined to complete the pitch. However, the rain quickly turned into torrential downpour, transforming the rock into a treacherous, slick surface. Mountains are capricious entities, and they offered no tributes to the ill-prepared. As slippery rocks gave way under the growing water weight, a sudden crack echoed throughout the valley. One of Neal's team members lost footing, sending a cascade of rock and debris down the pitch. Although the climber managed to grab the ledge, the fall shocked the group. Neal quickly assessed the situation, his heart racing. He recognized the precariousness of their position. Worsening conditions would complicate a rescue operation. Realizing that time was of the essence, he instructed the team to secure themselves as best they could while he checked on the struggling climber. Once he reached his teammates, Neal could see the panic in their eyes, but knew maintaining composure was vital. The rain continued to pour, and the rocks were slicker than ever. "We can't stay here," Neal shouted over the sound of the storm. "We need to move to the next ledge." With a steady voice, he encouraged his teammates to focus on his instructions as he assisted in moving them carefully. Despite Neal's best efforts, reaching the next ledge took longer than expected. As they maneuvered, a loud crash echoed through the valley. A massive rock slide threatened the entire area. The other team members had managed to find safety, but the situation was now dire for Neal and his teammate. With limited visibility due to the rain and rapidly descending fog, they clung to hope and to each other. Outside, climbers and spectators in the valley below were becoming increasingly concerned. Word spread about the others still high on the wall. By late afternoon, the Yosemite search and rescue team mobilized, fully aware of the challenging conditions they would have to face to save Neal and his team. As dusk settled over Yosemite, the rescuers deployed helicopters. Even as rain lashed against their efforts, they dropped supplies to the stranded climbers, offering food and warmth while technicians analyzed conditions from above. The air smelled of damp earth, and worry hung heavy, encapsulating the urgency. Meanwhile, Neal and his team clung to hope. "We're not giving up," Neal said firmly, reassuring his partner that help was on the way. Every single moment felt like an eternity as they waited, the darkness creeping around them, wrapping them tightly as if the mountain sought to consume them. As night fell, the illuminating beams of searchlights pierced through the fog, igniting a flurry of hope among the rescue teams. Suddenly, overhead the chop of helicopter blades resonated, and they felt the vibration through the granite walls. The mission was alive, and the rescuers were searching for them. They beamed flashlights back toward the lights, desperate to signal their location. With renewed determination and guided by the rescuers' signals, Neal and his partner began their descent to a safer ledge, barely able to see with rain still pouring. Each move was a delicate dance between assurance and fear. As they descended through the rocks, the ground beneath them finally steadied. When they reached a point where the rescuers could finally secure them, the salvation appeared like a beacon. A rope lowered from above, the lights illuminating the ledge. Exhausted but safe, Neal and his teammates were hoisted up to safety, greeted by the relieved faces of the search and rescue team. Back on the ground, safe at last and drenched but alive, Neal and his team embraced each other. On that stormy day when nature unleashed its fury, their resolve carried them through, and they emerged from the mountain with more incredible bonds than they had ever had before. That day they learned not just about climbing prowess, but the strength of teamwork and the indomitable human spirit in the face of adversity. The post at Pine Ridge. The sun dipped below the horizon as I settled into my solitary post atop Pine Ridge, my home for the summer as a fire lookout worker. I enjoyed the isolation, crisp mountain air, vibrant sunsets, and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the city. This was my sanctuary, a small cabin with a panoramic view of the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. As darkness enveloped the forest, I turned on my oil lamp, its warm glow flickering against the wooden walls. The radio crackled with static, a reminder that I was connected, however tenuously, to the world below. I kept my logbook nearby, jotting down the day's observations and checking in with the ranger station. "All clear," I reported, feeling a sense of pride in my responsibility. But tonight felt different. A dense fog rolled in as the sun sank, creeping up the trees like a ghost, swallowing the last hints of daylight. I peered through my binoculars, scanning the sprawling woods that now seemed to swirl with shadows. The sound of rustling leaves filled the air, louder than before, as if the forest was alive and whispering secrets I couldn't quite decipher. Around midnight, my ease exploded into full-blown terror. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, convinced I'd see an animal or perhaps the wind playing tricks on me, but there was nothing there. I returned to my logbook, dismissing it as fatigue. Sleep had been elusive these past few nights, and the shadowy edges of my mind were beginning to fray. Then, the first cold bump echoed through the cabin. I held my breath. It was followed by two more deliberate and rhythmic thumps. Someone, something, was knocking on the wooden exterior of the lookout. Goosebumps prickled my skin as I glanced around, my heart pounding. The sound was organized, almost as if it was trying to get my attention. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound unafraid. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Yet the knocking resumed, louder, more insistent, each thwack resonating through my bones. I peered out the small window, straining to see through the fog. The trees loomed like sentinels, blocking any trace of movement. Was it the wind, an animal testing the boundaries of my sanity? I returned to my desk, telling myself I was alone, and began to write again, hoping to drown out the sounds. But then I heard a soft voice whispering my name, barely audible over the howling wind. "Claire." Chills cascaded down my spine. My name echoed in the emptiness, its source lost to the night. "Who's there?" I exclaimed, panic rising in my throat. "Show yourself!" The answer came as the cabin violently shook, rattling to the very foundation. The knocking morphed into thunderous blows as if something immense were trying to break through the walls. I leapt to my feet, gripping the table for stability, the lantern's flame dancing wildly, threatening to extinguish. "Stop it!" I shouted, eyes wide and frantically searching for anything to explain this madness. In my mind, I replayed every horror story I had ever heard about fire lookouts. Ghosts of past rangers, lost souls wandering the woods, seeking revenge. I couldn't let those stories control me. I had to remain calm, but the voices grew louder, overlapping, and a cacophony filled my ears. Claire, help us! We're trapped! I stumbled back, heart racing, terror flooding my senses. The air grew thick and heavy, the temperature dropping as if I had entered a tomb. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, desperate to confront whatever had invaded my sanctuary. The fog swirled in, cold and biting, wrapping around me like icy fingers. "Show yourself!" I yelled into the void, but all I saw was the intimidating silhouettes of trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands clutching at the sky. Then, in the dense fog, I spotted them. Figures emerging silently, pale and translucent. Their faces were etched with anguish and fear. They moved slowly toward me, mere shadows in the night, but their eyes were piercing. I could feel their sorrow deep within my chest. "Please, help us," one whispered, echoing inside my skull. I stepped back, stumbling over the threshold, my breath hitching. "What happened to you?" I asked, desperation spilling from my lips. "Trapped." The voice reverberated a mournful chant that resonated with the wood's essence. "We cannot leave. You must help us." The figures advanced, and I could feel their pain washing over me like a wave. I realized then that they were lost souls, perhaps victims of past fires or tragedy, forever haunting this landscape. I wanted to run, to lock the door, but a force held me in place, compelling me to listen. Tears filled my eyes as I searched for words, something to ease their suffering. "What can I do?" I asked, voice trembling. They seemed to unite in a whisper, but I couldn't understand it. Something about breaking a barrier. Their voices, a haunting melody that wrapped around my heart. The weight of their collective grief bore down on me, and I thought about the fire season, the control towers, and what I had learned. That the woods were fragile, their spirits woven into the fabric of nature. The only way to help them, I realized, was through acknowledgement of their existence, an understanding of the life and the death that occurred in the very trees surrounding me. Heart pounding, I returned to the cabin, moved to the center of the room, and declared, "I see you, I hear you, I acknowledge your pain." I repeated it over and over, my voice carrying into the emptiness, the shadows swirling around me. Slowly, their forms began to dissolve, warmth flooding the air, and the sorrow in their voices faded into a gentle, whispering breeze. The voices turned into a murmur and then slowly drifted away, leaving the cabin unbothered by their long haunting presence. As dawn broke, the fog lifted, and I could see the sprawling expanse of the forest. Exhausted yet somehow relieved, I took a deep breath, knowing that Pine Ridge would always carry the weight of those lost souls, even as it stood guard over the living. Some nights as I sit alone in my lookout, I hear the rustle of leaves and whispers in the wind, a reminder of that chilling night. I learned to listen not just to my ears, but with my heart, and sometimes, when I'm in solitude, with my mind. The cries of the lost became an echo of hope, and to those willing to hear, you should always remember, there are strange things in this world, but sometimes a little bit of compassion can make everything okay, at least for the time being.
My name is Rob. For the past few years, I've held the position of Deputy Team Leader at the Brecon Mountain Rescue Team here in Wales. The BMRT is an essential emergency service in rural Wales, staffed entirely by volunteers and funded entirely by donations from the National Lottery and members of the public. Our work is not just restricted to mountain or wilderness search and rescue for climbers and hill walkers. Our skills are also deployed by the Welsh police to search for vulnerable or missing persons on assignments where we can employ our specialist medical and rescue techniques. I've seen some pretty wild things during my time in the rescue team, some of which may be more distressing or disturbing than others, some more than I'd care to admit. But there's only been one incident in my entire career that myself or my colleagues have not been able to fully explain. This is the story of that incident. Mountain rescue teams can only be called on the authority of the police. A call is normally initiated by the local force in response to a 999 call or the report of a missing person. The team can be and is usually called out at any time of day or night, under any conditions, even on New Year's Day and Christmas Day. The relevant police personnel will initially alert the rescue team by means of a pager message. A little outdated, I know, but it reflects the slimmer than slim budget we're forced to work with year in, year out. Once the volunteers receive their "I will respond" message, the ball gets rolling. A team leader or deputy team leader will then discuss the details of the incident with the coordinating police officers and decide an appropriate rendezvous point and if any additional assets need to be deployed. These can include additional teams, tracker dogs, or even helicopter support if the situation calls for one to be deployed. So I'm sitting in the Drover's Arms pub with a few mates, having just finished watching one of their younger brothers represent their high school in a rugby sevens match. Their team won. So, spirits are high. We've just finished some dinner, and I'm about to get stuck into my first pint of the evening when my beeper goes off. I won't lie, I was a bit annoyed. I'd really been looking forward to that pint, but we're explicitly told to expect things like that. Such is life of a mountain rescue volunteer. Anyway, I let the lads know I had to leave, put my coat on, and began to take the 10-minute walk up to the small set of offices that serve as the BMRT headquarters. It's early on a Sunday night. Most calls seem to happen around holidays and weekends, and the place is empty. So I unlock the doors to turn on all the lights, and walk down to my office to phone the police liaisons officer to get all the necessary details. As I'm talking to the officer in question, my phone starts lighting up with text messages from various other team members, telling me they're on their way. Everything was coming together nicely, and the situation seemed to be like usual. Basic search and rescue job. A couple of hikers went up into the hills on Saturday, intending to camp overnight before heading back down on Sunday afternoon. According to the person who had called it in, the hikers hadn't returned on schedule, nor were they answering any of their phones. So they called us. Now, on more than one occasion we've gotten calls from members of the public reporting missing people who weren't actually missing at all. Sometimes, groups are slowed down by dodgy ankles or an upset tummy or, something like that. I get why someone might panic, and it's always better to be safe than sorry. That's why the BMRT exists in the first place. So it's always helps when the person making the call knows a little bit about the missing person's group. Especially if they know the intended route, so we can retrace or follow it to the best of our, ability. That'll help us potentially find them nice and quickly too. If we can focus our search, we don't need helicopter support, which saves us a huge amount of money. I know that sounds callous, but we really do live and die on our funding, so it's essential we keep the purse strings tight. So, I'm going through all the core details with the liaison officer, determining where the group most likely started their trek. Determining the group's most likely whereabouts, trying to figure out where they started and where they could have gotten lost. We go through all the usual stuff, just like normal, then move on to the miscellaneous details that can often aid a search. These can include any medical conditions that might bring the persons into difficulty, age ranges, and things of that nature. You'd be amazed how tiny, seemingly insignificant details can help with the search. So it's extremely important that we compile as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Only when I pressed the liaison officer for more information regarding the emergency call itself, she became awful cagey. Very little in the way of detailed information could be passed along regarding the missing group. The only significant detail is that the woman who had reported them missing was absolutely distraught when she did so. The dispatcher had noted that no matter what she did or said, she could not seem to reassure the caller that their loved ones would be found. The caller seemed convinced that the group of hikers was gone and never coming back. Honestly, it's stuff like this that kept me in the BMRT for so long. Being the hero that people so desperately need at what for many is the lowest point of their lives thus far. Less than an hour after the initial beeper messages, myself and 4 additional volunteers had converged at the BMRT HQ, ready to begin our search. Our route would take us over 16 miles of hills and mountains, roughly 5 hours of solid walking. But it was likely we'd find the missing group of hikers in a fraction of that time. At least that's what we told ourselves initially. We did find something relatively quickly. After only 45 minutes worth of hiking up gently sloping trails, but it didn't fill us with confidence. In fact, it did the very opposite. We found a tent, an empty, abandoned tent. Being a BMRT volunteer sometimes means you're basically a detective. You can use small pieces of a puzzle to build up a larger picture of an overall situation. What we had before us was an empty 2-man tent, but we were looking for a total of 4 missing hikers. What was clear was that whoever had set this tent up had been easily able to make it down into the Brecon to report an emergency. Only, they hadn't. They had apparently gone back up the trail. But why would they do such a thing? This escaped us completely. This was the first really worrying sign as well. But what was obvious is that they had done so without even wearing their hiking boots. So they had climbed up the mountain barefoot in the middle of the night. That's definitely not good. This happened to be in the middle of March, not the coldest month of the year, but one which brings strong winds to central Wales. Wind chill can lower ambient temperatures by almost half, and tend to be the cause of most cases of hypothermia we encounter. A hiker can look outside, see a sunny day, and assume fine weather. But once they're up a mountain, the wind can drop the temperature into a single digit, and turn seemingly benign situations into a deadly one. But it wasn't just hiking boots that had been left behind either. A fair amount of cold weather clothing had been left behind in the tent, along with what appeared to be a significant amount of food and water. It was at that point that any hope of getting through this rescue without having to call in a helicopter support went right out the window. Whoever was lost out here needed help and quickly. So we called it in, and within a few minutes, a search and rescue helicopter had taken off from Neville Hall Hospital with the intention of flying the length of our proposed route. Our eye in the sky was on its way. It was fully dark with no stars by the time we made the call, and shortly afterward we began to see red and white flashing lights moving westward in the sky ahead of us. The helicopter's pilot and I exchanged greetings as they tuned into our radio frequency, and I kept in touch with them as best as possible as we advanced along our route. What's more, it didn't take long before the co-pilot spotted something unusual just about a mile or so ahead of us. According to the helicopter's crew, they had spotted a person running along one of the mountain trails in the opposite direction we were heading. They had tracked the individual's movement for a moment or two, before losing sight of them around a set of standing stones. There were over 30 standing stones in the Beacons National Park. Some of them are many centuries old and reeved in myth. It isn't known exactly how many of the surviving standing stones are prehistoric. Some appear to be memorial stones, and others, well, they seem to have had more than one function, either as a boundary marker, waymark on ancient trails, signposts, or even rubbing stones for livestock. But whatever their purpose was, we had our next rendezvous point. One that we would have to reach quickly, if we hoped to find our missing persons in good health. It took about 45 minutes of hard hill climbing before we reached the standing stones. They formed a high, rough circle, about 5 huge chunks of granite, worn and misshapen by the elements. According to the helicopter's crew, the person they had been tracking had run off the trail and into the standing stones before disappearing from view. It was more likely that the helicopter had simply let the person slip out of their searchlight and lost track of them. But why a person in peril would run away from the rescue chopper and not towards it was a complete and utter mystery to us. I mean, yeah, stranger things have happened on previous rescue attempts, but this little conundrum certainly left us scratching our head as we began to search for clues as to where the person might have headed to next. After a minute or two of combing the area, with only our personal torches for light, one of the many team members called over to me. Behind this standing stone, set into a little hillock that obscured from view, was a small opening in the earth. I say small, but it was just big enough for a fully grown adult to climb inside. And what was clear was that it was the perfect place for someone to hide in. And it would be a perfect place to, get away from the biting wind and rain. I stuck my torch inside the opening and peered inside, only then just seeing how deep the passageway seemed to go. Wales used to be a hub for the British coal mining industry, and the country is now littered with disused mining pits and shafts, both ancient and modern. Knowing this full well, the underground passage didn't strike me as unusual at first, and I actually thought the missing hikers were lucky that they might have come across something like this to shelter them. I called out down the opening, checking to see if anyone had slipped down the tunnel and had gotten themselves stuck whilst trying to take a shelter or something like that. I received no reply. I then called over to one of the other team members, who had happened to carry the majority of our climbing ropes. We harnessed him up, staked climbing pegs into the earth just outside the entrance, and began to lower him into the opening to check for signs of life. We lowered him down so far into the earth that I began to worry about the prospect of getting him stuck. But thankfully, we didn't have to lower him any further before he found something. He called out for us to pull him up, alerting us that he had found an item of clothing that possibly belonged to one of our missing hikers. So we did just that. We pulled him back up, took the item of clothing from him, and lowered him back down to continue looking. As he did so, I took a quick look at the jumper he had brought up, and was struck by something unusual about it. It looked old, really old. Clothing exposed to the elements for long periods can end up looking pretty rough, but not that rough. It appears as though it had been stuck down in that hole for far too long. We didn't find anything else down that hole, or the rest of the mountain. We stayed up there until about 3 in the morning, long after our helicopter support had to withdraw due to dwindling fuel. But we didn't find a single thing. No more clothes, no more signs of life, and no more bodies. The more it became clear that we weren't going to find anything, the more I thought about how the distress caller seemed convinced that the hikers were gone. She had no way of knowing that whatsoever, yet somehow she was right. And that really didn't sit right with me, at all. Throughout the next week, 2 more search parties took to the hills in hopes of finding a trace of our missing hikers. Both came back empty-handed. I expected reports of the missing hikers to appear in local news publications, only they didn't. When I tried to find out why, I was turned away by most police sources until one, slip, that a judge at the High Court of England and Wales had placed a publication ban on the incident, meaning an order prohibiting publication under Section 11 of the Contempt of Court Act in 1981 was in effect, keeping all news of the incident out of newspapers. But that's not what really bothers me about this whole thing. I mean, it's been confounding, sure, but it's another peculiar detail surrounding the case, and it keeps me up at night. The name stitched into the jumper we found down that hole in the earth was Robert Williams. I came to find out that this didn't match any of the names we had been given regarding to our missing hikers. In fact, Robert Williams had been missing from a nearby town of Neath since March of 2002. 17 years before our missing hikers were reported. Who was it that our helicopter support had spotted before they disappeared among the standing stones? Was it one of our missing hikers, or was it, in fact, the long-lost Robert Williams? Regardless, I can't help but think I find the answers to these questions at the bottom of that tunnel, hidden somewhere among those standing stones.
Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright strange search and rescue and Firewatch horror stories. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to slap that like button as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this episode gets, the more YouTube promotes it, and that helps us grow our ever-expanding waters here in the swamp. If you're new, why not join us? Be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications as we upload new episodes almost every single day in all things natural and supernatural. If you're on the go, but don't have YouTube Premium, but you still want to download and listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories no matter where you are, you can download them absolutely free from Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and literally everywhere else you find podcasts online. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. You can also go to Reddit at r/thedarkswamp and send in your stories there. I would love to see them and potentially share them. Thank you guys so much for supporting the swamp the way you do. I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.